Hey everybody, welcome back and thank you again for joining me. The publishing industry is a very long game, and what makes it feel a lot longer is often the fact that we as writers tend to spin our wheels. We're very good, I think, in the beginning of having a lot of that motivation and that drive to learn how to write, but as time goes on, I notice, especially even with myself, that we're not very good at recognizing our mistakes. We will perhaps spend years going through and making the same mistakes over and over and not fixing them, which inevitably leads to more and more rejections and a much longer delay in the process of eventually getting your work published. So today, I want to go over the two sorts of authors that will never be published. I suppose it's two sorts of writers because an author is someone who's published, but you get my point. If you find that you fall into either of these categories, do not worry. This is going to be a video to help you out and perhaps show you the error of your ways and offer you some solutions. And I myself actually fall into one of these categories. So we're all learning here. All right. So this is going to be category 1. These are the writers that are the perpetual revisers, the sort that are going to die with a bunch of first drafts stacked up high in their office drawer. The sort of writers that delay even longer on sending work out because these stories are just not quite perfect. Often they are the ones that don't even finish their first book. They will go through and spend 6 months revising a single chapter, not wanting that little imperfect chapter to ever have a second and a third one to follow it. The sort that fears even the smallest of issues with a story in one chapter can derail an entire project and needs to be addressed now, rather than waiting for the whole thing to be done and then seeing the larger picture. The sort of writers that deal with analysis paralysis, the sort that just simply never send anything off. You're simply not finishing work, and as a result, you never get a chance to ever send anything off. You will, in effect, never be published because you've never dared to send off anything, because you've probably never completed anything. Or perhaps you've completed it, but simply have a sort of fear of rejection and a fear of critique holding you back. For those that fall into this category, I fortunately have some tips to help you out. The main piece of advice I can offer to you is the idea of changing your mindset. You need to start going from thinking of yourself as someone who is a creative, who is a master of their craft, and start realizing that your job as a writer is not to be creative. It's not to be this masterful weaver of prose. Your job is to send work off. That is it. In fact, I would actually encourage you to take a little sticky note or write something on your blackboard or whiteboard, whatever you have at your house, and just write, my job is to send work off. That is it. If you can begin to ingrain this philosophy, it's going to make everything else much, much easier. You see, the idea of creativity being something that needs to be perfected, and the idea that you need to send off only your very best of best work will keep you from ever making any true progress. It's difficult, if not impossible, to ever really revise a story that's not written incomplete in the first place. You can't do a second or third draft on a story that has never had the first draft written. No matter how good and how nice the prose of perhaps the first draft story chapters are, if you spend 6 months going through this and you only get perhaps 2 or 3 chapters written, those may be excellent chapters, but you don't have a complete story. And as such, you can never truly make any meaningful progress because you need to see the whole picture to make any real progress on your story. So instead, I would encourage you to start thinking about, my job is to send work off. Your job is to get out there and get this to as many people as possible, regardless at times of how diminished the quality might be. This is the mentality I want you to try to adopt here. This is what will help you actually get out of that perfectionist mind state. It's not easy, and even listening to this video is not really going to be the thing that's going to help you too much. It's going to be a continual practice and a continual reminder that you as a creative individual need only to send work off. A real game changer for you will actually be to write down a deadline that you're going to send work off. Actually put something on your desk, again, on your wall, on your calendar, whatever it might be, and say, on this date, I am going to send my work off. If it is a short story, on this date, I'm going to send it to LitMags, and I will not revise it anymore. If this is the first draft of a story, write down on your calendar, by this date, I will have the first draft done. And you can give yourself as much time as you want. Give yourself a year. The time frame doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot, but it's the fact that you have set yourself a time when you will have this story completed. In the case of the first draft, while you're not sending anything off and you have only yourself to be accountable to, adding some sort of stakes to that will be beneficial. Everything from saying, in 6 months, I will have a first draft of this story completed, or I will abandon the project altogether. That can be helpful. It puts some sort of pressure on you to get something done. And it will start to ingrain in you that the idea of getting your work finished, even if it's only half as good as a really nice revised chapter or a really nice revised draft, is better than having a perfect 2 or 3 chapters in an incomplete story. You can always go back later and revise it. But you need to have set deadlines to keep yourself accountable. This will also help combat the quote-unquote lizard brain mentality. Basically what this is it's a feeling that we all get. I experience it all the time. I'm sure you do too, where you start projects off and you have a lot of confidence. You have a lot of self-belief in them. You think this is going to be a great story. And when it becomes time to start sending work off, when you get closer and closer and closer to that day when you need to submit work, that's when you start feeling what Stephen Pressfield might call the resistance, right? You start feeling that psychological terror, that worry that you're going to be judged, that your work is going to be rejected outright, that you are wasting your time, that your piece just simply is not good. And when you have a set deadline, this feeling is going to come up especially when you get closer to it. But having the set deadline also forces you to work with that, to actually ignore it in a way. It, again, is something that takes practice, and it's something that you will gradually get over as time goes on. But having a set deadline will help you to combat this. It is this feeling of insecurity and this worry, we all experience it. And so having a set deadline will definitely help you. That advice now is excellent for a very broad picture. Deadlines and holding yourself accountable works great. But now I'm going to offer you one other piece of advice that works a bit better on the micro, on the more immediate. When you work on a chapter, tell yourself that you will not revise that chapter until the next one is written. If you've been stuck on chapter 1, trying to perfect that prose, trying to get everything to say exactly what it needs to say, trying to master that opening line, now tell yourself, okay, we're done with this. I will not touch this chapter at all until chapter 2 is written. And then once you've penned chapter 2, perhaps then you go back and do some revisions. You give yourself a little bit of permission to make some changes. And then slowly say, all right, nothing more. I will not revise chapter 2 until chapter 3 is done. This is probably the fairest compromise you can ever really have with your creative self. If you're a perfectionist and you're dying to not let a chapter ever sit there unmastered, unwell done, this is a good compromise because it allows you to do some revision, and at the same time you get a little bit more new work done. So eventually you still are moving forward. You're not just polishing the train that's sitting on the tracks, you're actually having the engine move at the same time, so you do finally get to that destination. Now we'll get over to category number 2, which is my people. All right, so if you're like me, this is going to sound really, really, really familiar to you. This category of writers who will never be published are the ones that submit too often. You submit work that is not quite complete. You send off work that is 70% of the way there. You get to the point where you finish a draft of a story and you say, all right, I'll do a second, maybe a third draft, or have a buddy take a look at my second draft and make some corrections. You are the people that, for lack of a better term, half-ass your projects. This is not always necessarily out of an act of laziness, but simply out of a very flawed mentality. You recognize that the perfectionist mindset isn't going to work. That if you continually revise work over and over, you will never, ever get anything published. On a very logical and emotional level, you understand that. And so what you do is your brain does this little thing where you go, hey, I am going to start sending off work now in much more frequent periods of time with much less quality of work, because I'd rather chance a story that is 70% of the way there rather than simply revise my whole life and never get anything off. And while I plead with you on this, while I stand here as someone who used to think the exact same way, you need to recognize that a little bit of perfectionism is probably going to get you much further than where you're at now. You can't rush this process. You can't have the mentality of, well, I'm going to send off to 100 agents and I'm sure one of them will say yes. And so you send off work that's not quite ready just to kind of barrel through those 100. You send off work just in the hopes that, all right, I'll get 50 rejections and maybe that 51st will go through. Or you try and rush the idea of the 10,000 hour rule. You think, okay, the more pages I write, the better I'm going to be. So I'm just going to crank out a bunch of pages here and get through that, and hopefully my skill will evolve over time. Not recognizing that it is the very slow and very deliberate practice that someone like a perfectionist does to an extreme that actually improves your prose. It is not so much the quantity of what you're doing, but the quality that really matters when it comes to mastering the art of writing. So if you're like me and you fall into this category, my advice would be to curb your ambition. You're simply being too impatient. You are, in effect, wasting really good ideas and really good projects in the couple months, couple years, or how much time you've put in on getting a story to 70%, and you are just wasting it. You are wasting any potential for it to be a masterpiece because you're just a little too eager to get things off. Instead, take a step back, re-examine your timetables, look at your quality and say, I've been sending off to all these agents, all these lit mags, what have you, and I've been getting nothing but no's. Yes, perhaps a few very pleasant, send us more work replies, which are encouraging, but examine that and realize I don't have a problem with perfectionism. I don't have a sort of writer's block around quality. That is not the worry. That is not what I need to worry about. I actually need to spend a bit more time on these projects. I actually need to be a bit more concerned about the quality of my work. And this is difficult because I feel like a lot of this comes from a place of ignorance. You simply have unrealistic timetables and timeframes for your project, but you probably don't know what a reasonable time frame might be. You may not know what a reasonable number of drafts could be. And so the cure for this, the real deep down cure, is to start coming up with better expectations, much more reasonable time frames. Look at other authors that have been published. See how many times they revised their work. Look at authors when they first started, those very first stories, before they had agents and editors and all that stuff. See how many times they went through their stories. I remember a time when I had first started out that I thought all I ever needed to do was write 3 drafts of a story and I'd be done. This mentality came from Stephen King's book On Writing, which I read very early in my career. Stephen King, for all of his amazing work, has a mentality that I don't think works well for newbies. He says in his book, I do 3 drafts, a first draft, a second draft, and then a polish. And then it is sent off. And while this mentality is awesome for him, because at the time of writing that book, he'd been writing for, 30 years? For many of us who are starting out, it's not enough. Even if you have several years under your belt, you probably are not going to need only 3 drafts. It is probably going to be closer to 10 or more. That is just the reality of this process. And again, it's something that even I've had to learn myself over this past year. So instead, take longer. Double your time frame. If you gave yourself 2 months to get a short story written and finished and sent off to a lit mag, give yourself 4. See what will happen then. Another strategy, which I find to be very, very helpful, is start at page 1. Go right to the beginning of your story and start reading through it. Keep on reading until you get to the point where it sounds off, where just the prose itself, as you read it out, perhaps read it aloud, but get to the point where the prose sounds a little bit off to you. The sentence doesn't quite make sense. Revise that, and then keep going. Be methodical. Go right down the list. What you'll find is that you probably have more wonky sentences, more uneven prose, things that just aren't quite right, that you've perhaps dismissed as, well, it's not perfect, but it's really good, I think. Go through those, find those mistakes, and make them perfect. I think for a lot of us that fall into this category, we recognize to a degree that our work isn't quite perfect. We recognize that there's a section or two that maybe isn't quite right, but we think the strength of the piece overall, all the other good things that we wrote, will somehow outweigh that. That when an editor, for example, looks at our story, they'll go, well, yeah, the stuff here and stuff here doesn't work, and this is a little bit weird, but my God, the concept is great. The character is awesome. The plot really does work well. I'd say we take a chance on them. This mentality has to go. You have to be a bit more harsh with yourself and a bit more critical of your work and recognize that you can't have that. You can't allow for that to happen, for an editor to just hopefully overlook some of the things that are wrong and still take you on. It's a bit like in pro fighting, where a fighter hopes that the judge's score will win them the entire fight. They think, I'm not going to try and knock this guy out. I'm just going to try and win on points. That works at times, and if you're a real good master of it, that works often. But you're leaving things to chance. You're always leaving it up to someone else to determine your fate. You're leaving it up to the judges to decide, rather than going for the knockout punch yourself and guaranteeing the win. With writing, you have to go for the knockout punch. You cannot leave it up to the judges to decide. Master your story, and they will take it. Don't leave it up to them to maybe chance something on you. Well, that's it. Those are what I would call the two categories of writers who will never be published. If you found that you fall into one of those categories, I encourage you to try and make some of these corrections. It can be a bit scary when I use like absolute language like that, when I say you'll never be published. But recognize that as absolutist as that terminology is, it's kind of true, right? You'll never be published if you never send anything off, like a category 1. And if you're in the second category, you'll never have work that is of a quality that people will want to publish it. If you can recognize that, if you can, on an emotional level, understand what I'm saying, I think you will be willing to make these changes and actually notice that maybe in 6 months, maybe a year, your writing finally starts to take off. Maybe you start getting some acceptances, or maybe you just finally finish that story. You finally get that draft done. And so if you found this helpful, please give it a like, and I will see you all next week.